We put a lot of pressure on teachers to bring students up to snuff, but really, somebody can't learn anything if they don't have a motivation to learn it.
Welcome back to Educator University. As teachers, some of the most effective strategies we use aren't new. They're actually ancient and rooted in philosophy. So why have they lasted? Today we are joined by Joel Bouchard, who hosts his own podcast about philosophy. He is also a doctoral student in psychology, author, artist, and Army veteran. Joel's going to help us explore how ancient philosophy continues to shape the way we teach today. Welcome, Joel.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good to have you. I think, like the intro mentioned, we have a lot of strategies in teaching that are based in ancient philosophies, things like Socratic seminars, philosophical chairs, inquiry-based learning. Why do you think these have lasted the test of time?
Yeah, I think that the answer is surprisingly simple, and that is that it's kind of the natural way human beings learn, right? If we go back to an ancient time before there was formal education, and you really think about just, how people would acquire new knowledge, or even in modern day times, right? If you're not in school or you're not at work and you're learning something new from somebody, how does it happen? And if you think about it, lots of times it does occur in a way that's similar to Socratic seminars or philosophical chairs, depending on how many parties are involved. But there's usually some dialogical exchange of information that is then, followed by questions, follow-up questions to sort of, parse apart the details of what's going on that, requires critical thinking, right? And also some of those things that, are really helpful in a face-to-face environment, like, empathy and communication skills, things that are we all know that there's a difference between face-to-face learning and then writing a paper, right, for instance. So some of those things are easier to hone in person. And it's active, right? It's not a lecture format. It's something where there's an exchange between a student and teacher, or two different parties, one where there's a knowledge that wants to be exchanged. So it's a timeless thing, right? It's something that we might have been developed, we trace it back to Socrates and Plato and stuff, but there's a good chance it was going on long before them even, right? It's just the natural way that people learn in a face-to-face environment. So I think that that's the reason that they've lasted so long, right? I don't think that you could get rid of them, really.
Yeah. I think in education, sometimes we make it complicated, which sometimes we have to kind of get more into the details. But in a way, you're right. It's back to the basics almost. Even before Plato and Socrates, this was always going on in terms of educating and passing on that knowledge to the next generation. So yeah, that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it's just the way that, especially as somebody who's a generalist like I am, that's the way that I've learned a lot of things. I'm a musician, so I've got a bunch of different albums and I play a bunch of different instruments. And, if you're learning an instrument, that's usually the way you do it, right? If you go to a guitar teacher, a piano teacher or something, right? In some cases, you can start with the music theory and there can be some sort of lecture type exchange. But a lot of cases, it's this idea of, a teaching being given, a practical demonstration being given, the ability to ask questions, the ability to demonstrate knowledge. It's a reciprocal sort of process rather than something that's just sort of one-sided.
Yeah, there's definitely a natural approach to learning anything, like you said, not just in this classroom, but with music or any other thing you're wanting to learn. These approaches are very timeless in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of honing in onto one of these timeless approaches is the Socratic seminar, or kind of this idea of Socrates and the way he taught. Could you explain more about where that originated in philosophy with your background in terms of how did that even start and what did it look like back in the day?
Yeah, so Socratic dialogue obviously goes back to Socrates, who we believe was a historical figure, although, Plato writes everything that we know about Socrates. Socrates doesn't have any writings of its own. It's all through Plato's mouth. So we don't know for sure if he was historical or, if he was perhaps an amalgamation of characters or sort of an exemplar. But regardless, in the writings where you see Socrates talking with people, if you've ever read one, it's really interesting, right? Because it follows this sort of template where usually somebody will posit a position and then Socrates will, and usually when you hear the position, you go, okay, well, that sounds good. That sounds like a reasonable thing to think. And then Socrates asks one question and the guy gives a reasonable answer. And then Socrates will ask another question and then there's another reasonable answer and another question. And you go, well, now I'm not sure. And then through more and more questions, eventually you get to a point where the whole position seems to kind of fall apart because some of the base assumptions weren't in order. And so really, I think that that's kind of the purpose of the Socratic method, is challenging some of those underlying assumptions. So Socrates was, as far as we know, right, the originator of it. Again, I doubt that's true, right? Because if you think about it, in some ways, children use the Socratic method all the time, right? You get confronted by, hey, why is this like this? And you answer them and they go, well, why is that? And you go, well, because like, well, why is that? Well, why is that? And then you end up telling them to go play with their toy or, do something else, right? Because they get you back to a point where you can't really quite explain it. And, we call that in philosophy the illusion of explanatory depth, right? We like to think that we know how things operate, but when you really kind of peel back the first few layers of the onion, lots of times, especially in our modern world where things are so complicated, we realize that we know much less about how things operate than we thought we did, right? And so I think that's sort of the main reason behind the Socratic method, is challenging underlying assumptions, demonstrating the limits of our own knowledge, and really having this sort of collaborative discussion that can lead to greater engagement and kind of lifelong learning.
Yeah, it's a very powerful method for students to think for themselves. And like you said, the more you dive into something, the more you realize you don't really know anything about anything until you start to peel those layers like the onion, like you said. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is really, one of the primary tenets of my philosophy, right? And what we do with my podcast and things is usually each week we look at one or two words, just a word or two for an hour at a time, right? And delve into the etymology and what philosophers have said about it in the past, and then try to parse it apart, given our modern viewpoints, and ask speculative questions about it, right? So it really is that's all philosophy is. It's just looking at something in a way that involves much more critical thinking and metacognitive engagement, and really taking something that we thought was one thing on face value, or that we thought we understood, and getting it to a point where we go, oh, well, actually, this is much more complicated than we ever thought it could be.
Yes, yes. I recently got back into yoga and I realized, going back into it, you think yoga, one thing, but really it's 1,000 things. It's 1,000 different ideas and practices and poses. And so I think it's like you just think, oh, this one thing, but like you said, one word can have so many meanings. So I'd love that especially for our students to think like they could dive into one topic for a long time. And that's where some of our conversations go in terms of helping students find student-based inquiry, where it comes to them choosing a topic and really exploring. Is there a basis for that in history as well, from your understanding?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that all learning is sort of student based to some regard, right? I think that we put a lot of pressure on teachers right now to sort of bring students up to snuff. But really, somebody can't learn anything if they don't have a motivation to learn it. And that's just the hard truth, right? There has to be some willingness on the student side in order to engage with a topic. And again, if we conduct these thought experiments of what life looked like before modern education, or if we look at modern day people outside of a formal education or a formal work environment, what things do they tend to learn, right? It tends to be things that are personal to them, that they have an interest in, that they want to actually engage with, right? And so, yes, there are certain things that we, the government or our workplaces deem fundamental to our skill sets, in order to perform as human beings in society. But I think that the job of education is short of showing how personal interests and those things that are deemed foundational to being, a productive member of society can overlap, right? And I think that that's the way a lot of it has gone. Yeah, as far as ancient origins for student-led learning, Aristotle's Lyceum is kind of one that sticks out in like the written record. So after Socrates and Plato, Aristotle was Plato's student. He formed his own school, Lyceum, where students would walk and just talk with each other, question each other, and make observations and things. And it's not just Western philosophers either. Confucius had a very similar approach with his students over in China by learning how to do things through reflection and practical practice. And really before the modern education system, the modern college system and things, most learning was through apprenticeships, right? You had a master and an apprentice would, and this is sort of goes back to what I was saying, right? this personal interest and, learning functional skills. To be an apprentice to something, right, you really had to take an interest in whatever it was, blacksmithing or barrel making or shoemaking or whatever. But through taking an interest in that thing, you also gain skills through these sort of engagements with a master that led you into being productive as well. So that's kind of the historical sort of timeline was, Aristotle. And again, sure, it goes much farther than him. But as far as documentation goes, Aristotle, Confucius, into sort of feudal apprenticeships, that sort of thing, and up to the modern day.
I love you mentioning apprenticeship because that really is student-based inquiry because the students are pragmatically needing to know what to do if they're going to be if a student back in the day was needing to learn a skill, they were in the moment, they were having to figure it out and having to ask questions and figure it out on their own, which is a little different than our current education system. And that's one piece that I think where we sometimes have to almost put it into our educational system because it's not always natural for students to ask questions. We bring up topics or we have to teach things that maybe they don't have an interest in. So it's like figuring out where the inquiry is, where are they interested in learning more. So I think that's why we're trying to sometimes plug those things into our classroom.
Yeah, yeah, and I have a good example of that. Before I took philosophy in college, I didn't know what it was, right? I just kind of assumed it had something to do with guys with big beards and dusty books and things. But I needed an elective, so I took it. And the professor was just this dynamic guy who used these methods that we're talking about, right? Used the philosophical chairs and the Socratic method and things, and really fostered student engagement, and discussion and debate amongst each other. And I realized that it had been my favorite topic my whole life. I just didn't know it, right? Because philosophy often is presented as this sort of dry, stale, clear-cut thing. But really, like I was mentioning earlier in the show, it can be about anything and anybody can do it. It's just the process of looking at something deeper and really parsing it apart. And through questioning in the class and through staying after and talking and stuff, now he's my resident expert for my podcast, right? He comes onto the show and we talk about philosophy all the time. And I have several professors where that's the case, and not every teacher, not every professor can be a mentor or a master, and not every student can be an apprentice just based off of numbers. There can be topics and there can be interests that students have that if they're passionate enough about, they can find a mentor, in a teacher or in a professor. So that's one thing I would say, to educators is always be open to. I think sometimes, like with anything else, we can get into the mindset that it's a job, but really, I think sometimes opening yourself up to an appropriate student relationship can open some doors in ways that you didn't imagine, right? We never assumed we'd be doing a podcast together when, 10 years after I graduated. But, you can form those types of relationships. You can make those kinds of impacts on people that can change their lives.
Yeah, I see the excitement when you talk about these things in real life and how they impacted you. And so having a professor that made that connection is really special. And I actually had a kind of a full circle moment as well because I had a professor on who was my professor a couple episodes ago. And it was just one time, it's not always a permanent thing, but just having that connection was such a powerful thing to just have that piece back into your life for a minute there. So yeah, absolutely agree. I kind of want to go back to the idea too, where you mentioned it's not just, something dusty and old and forgotten about, which is philosophical chairs. We didn't really get into that one as much. Maybe you could share a little bit more about that in terms of education and keeping that relevant, and how was it kind of originated, and how do we use it today in art and teaching?
Yeah, so philosophical chairs, again, it comes from that same sort of time period, ancient Greece, and it's based on the dialectic, is what they call it, which is this idea of sort of engaging in respectful discussion in order to refine ideas. So, again, it's sort of similar to a Socratic method, but instead of, how would you put it, a defense and an attacking position, it's more evenly based, right? And dialectical in our modern usage refers to a complex sort of concept. Something, a lot of things go into understanding it, right? And that seems kind of appropriate. So Plato and Aristotle, they were student and teacher, right? Mentor and apprentice, and they didn't always agree on everything. As a matter of fact, a lot of the things that we think of as the big categories of modern thought are, you can put them on one side or the other. You're either with Plato or you're with Aristotle. So more disagreement than agreement between the two of them. But they obviously had a lot of respect for the other's intelligence and the way that, thoughts occurred. And so they engage in these kind of respectful dialogues. And, it encourages really, active listening. Again, it goes back to those things that are easier to facilitate in everyday life and face-to-face, scenarios where you're empathetic, right? You're listening actively because you know that it's not so much about what the answer is going to be. You know that there's going to be a back and forth. So anything that you say, you have to sort of think about it some because the other person is going to do the same thing and they're going to come back with a retort or, question, and you have to be able to answer. So that's where the philosophical chairs come from, is all the way back from the beginning on these two guys kind of talking together.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that Socrates and Aristotle, I didn't think there was such a difference in the two, but you're saying that there actually was quite a difference in their philosophies. So, yeah.
Yeah. Plato was an idealist. And so it's kind of a hard position to explain because we're so scientifically based today. So a lot of our thoughts are empirically reductionist in a monist type of way, right? Everything's physical. So the best way to think about it is like the thoughts that I have come from my physical brain, right? If I didn't have a brain, I couldn't have thoughts. Plato's idea was a little bit different. He said that there's ideal things out there, right? And so he was more of a Cartesian dualist, right, where he thought that the body and the mind, or the soul, however you want to put it, were separate things. And so there was perfect forms out there, and anything in reality is basically a corrupted version of it, right? So somewhere out there's a perfect mind, there's perfect virtues, and in our everyday life, we can do courageous acts, for instance, but there's no perfect courage in real life. Whereas Aristotle's more down to earth. He's a more down to earth guy. So yeah, that's kind of the easiest distinction between the two of them. But that you can easily see how that sort of spreads not into just metaphysics and epistemology, but really every branch of knowledge, right? If you have this wildly diverse kind of viewpoint, the two of them didn't agree on much. But Aristotle, Aristotelian thought is really kind of the foundation of modern Western thinking. Aristotle is very down to earth. He was what we'd call the first natural philosopher, which is kind of a scientist. He'd go around, he studied biology and he studied geology and he studied all of the different things that we consider science today, and really kind of rooted them in the natural world and observations, right? Rather than sort of this lofty abstract thinking that Plato did a lot of.
Yeah, that is a good distinction between the two pieces. Just so as we're thinking too with the different strategies, there is a little bit different of a theme behind each one as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that you've mentioned this a lot in kind of your experience with philosophy and your experience learning it as a student, and then now in your podcast, being able to explore really engaging topics with your professor. It really, I feel like philosophy asks really open-ended questions. In our schools, sometimes, unfortunately, just the way it goes, there's a lot of standards and a lot of testing at times. What do you think about, like, how can teachers maybe create more space for this inquiry and philosophy to give more of that passion that you had and you found when you were a student?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and it's becoming more and more difficult. I think that there's sort of this misguided notion that the more standards we put in, or the more testing we take, or the more we can account for every minute of what's happening in a classroom, the more successful students will be. But again, it's misguided. It's a fallacious assumption because that's not really how learning works. We've been talking about it quite a bit, right? Natural learning to humans is open-ended, right? And I would even argue that the purpose of the Socratic method, Socrates would probably argue with me, or Plato, whoever wrote it. But to me, the Socratic method isn't even really about finding answers, right? Because with a lot of philosophy, if you continue to ask questions, you can always get back to a spot where you can't find answers. As a matter of fact, science is kind of built on that, this testing of the null hypothesis, this falsifiability. There's no theory of everything, right? You have to have initial preconditions on which to base a theory in order to have testable predictions. So, you can basically assail any position and question it back far enough that there's not going to be an answer, right? And so that that's a difficult and scary thing for some people, right? I think philosophers are a weird masochistic breed where we go, yeah, I love uncertainty and ambiguity and kind of, these big terrifying questions like, is there a God, or what happens after you die, or what happens, before the universe. But I think that even everyday questions become very difficult to answer outside of sets of preconditions, right? So as a result, that was a long-winded way of saying open-ended questions are very important, right? Because they might not lead to definitive answers, but what they do is they cultivate the way that you think, right? And how we think determines how we learn in the future. So, in order to grasp concepts, students have to be able to master principles of critical thinking, metacognitive reflection, how to ask good questions, right? And and really being active listeners and engaged. And the way that you do that is through open-ended questions. So, I think that, again, it's misguided to think that if we just structure things enough and we test enough and we have enough standards, everything will straighten itself out. I think that by this point, we should realize that that's not really working. So how do teachers help themselves, right? Despite all of the regulations that they face. My favorite is always opening a class with an open-ended question or two. I think that that's a really cheap and easy way to get students interested in things. So when I've developed lesson plans in the past, that's always the first thing I do is right off the bat, just ask a big open-ended question and just field a couple responses. You don't have to get lost in the weeds or anything like that, but just give the students a chance to answer, a chance to think, a chance to hear other students' perspectives before you delve into a topic. And doing just that much is enough to get them a little bit more interested than they would have been. And then from there, throughout a lecture or throughout different activities, kind of leaving some space for students to think, right? My podcast is a little bit different where we don't do any editing. So there are times where, and the reason we do that is because we want to model how philosophical discussion happens, right? Sometimes if you're having a philosophical discussion, you put your foot in your mouth, you contradict yourself. You have to pause for 5 seconds and think. You kind of go, it has these weird moments, right? And there's a part of me that goes, well, if I cut that out, right, that presents a disingenuous view of me as a thinker, right? It makes me look like I know all the answers or that I know what's happening, right? So we leave all that stuff in there just so that people can see that, hey, here we are, I've got, a professor of philosophy, doctoral student in psychology, and we flub all the time just trying to work through that stuff, right? That failure isn't failure, right? That's just how learning works. Learning is failure. It's little failures that gradually refine our ability to accomplish a task or to understand a topic, right? So that would be the other thing I'd say is, throughout a lecture, throughout a class lesson plan, leave some room for reflection. And again, just peppering in questions throughout and, really trying to balance both the standards with exploration of the topic. We can't always teach to the test. Sometimes there has to be just that ability to really relish what it is that we're looking at, and really look at learning and teaching as a joint exploration more than, this sort of rote task that is so highly structured and that's all focused on testing.
Yeah, we actually in teaching, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but the word bell work, which means when students come in, they usually have some little tasks to do. And so I think, like you said, having an open-ended question as part of that bell work task would be a great opportunity for teachers listening to maybe use that and start using that in their classroom today. And then, of course, leaving space, like you said, leaving space for that learning. And sometimes that requires an awkward pause, like you said, not just in your podcast, but also in the classroom. It's like, do you find when you're teaching sometimes you have to like embrace the awkwardness of just waiting for answers or the awkwardness of people saying things that maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. As human beings, we're not computers. So we can't calculate responses and just spit them out, instantaneously. There's definitely times where you have to be able to just sit back and chew on something and to let everybody else do the same and to kind of see where some of those things lead rather than just, jumping right in with an instant response or even worse, just ticking off the box that, okay, well, we talked about that. Let's move on to the next part of the curriculum. So yeah, I think it's really important to have some of those silences instituted.
You mentioned that you have done lesson plans and things like that. So when you're doing some of these more challenging topics, do you have any tips for teachers? Because I think that's one of the reasons sometimes we don't dive into certain things. We don't want to cause any, I don't know, discussions that we're like not sure how to cultivate. So are there tips that you have when you're cultivating discussions that might create difference of opinion that kind of create a respectful space that you use?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. I talk about, through podcasting and through, philosophy talks, I talk about a lot of difficult things, which is a little bit different than talking about it in the classroom. But I think that, there's always room for a disclaimer, saying something up front, right? And especially in higher education, right? In college, college students are adults, right? And so, there's something to be said for, listen, we're going to talk about some difficult stuff, but really that's the purpose of higher education, right? Higher education isn't just about, getting some job training and getting your piece of paper and going on to your, occupation. It's about engaging with difficult ideas, engaging with foreign ideas, right? Really coming to understand, how the world works and what we think about it. And so I think offering that up front, and just opening up students to the idea and the possibility of doing some hard mental work. Things aren't going to just be presented in a simplistic way. That's helpful. Another way about it is to not take sides. I actively attempt not to do that in any case, right? I've got a philosophy podcast, and that's one of our number one rules is we don't make fun of any religion. Why? Because so that stuff, that it lays outside the realms of science. So you can never prove it, right? Any religion could be correct. We don't have the answers to it, right? And then going back to, discussions of the illusion of explanatory depth and how little we know about everything, it sort of carries over a little bit. You go, okay, we're going to talk about some things, and there's going to be not just two sides to any question. There's going to be an infinite number of perspectival positions you could take on something. And what we're here to talk about is not what those different positions are or to tell you, what you should believe, but we're here to talk about the essence of the phenomenon, right? What science has told us about it, what history's told us about it, what these sorts of views are, and then really tell the students that their job is to sort of playfully integrate those concepts into their own thinking, right? So that's the way that I kind of like to think about it, is sort of disarming it a little bit. I think that that's part of the problem that we have as a society is this, we have this, it's always a two-sided thing. It's always adversarial, and there's a lot of threat and danger in any given topic. And there really doesn't need to be. It doesn't have to be that way. But it takes a very skilled teacher in order to sort of set the groundwork in such a way that students understand that. So yeah, my philosophy teacher was great at it. He'd bring up topics like, abortion or, different religions and things. But it was always with that disclaimer that we're going to talk about difficult things. It was always with the acknowledgement of all the perspectives. And it was always with, the view that, listen, we don't need to make this as serious as people like to make it, right? We can talk about this as ideas. We can talk about this in an abstract fashion that allows us to engage with it without it dictating to us what something is or the fact that it's threatening. So that it's sort of a hard thing to get across, but I think that's the best way I could kind of state it.
Yes, I like the idea of a disclaimer and laying the groundwork, all the things you mentioned, because as teachers, that's a really important part of having these discussions is, first of all, clarifying the expectations, especially with younger students. I'm a middle school teacher right now, so it's like I always tell my students, don't attack the person, just the argument, because, sometimes you can get a little bit catty. So I think there's all those pieces as well. Like you said, just setting that disclaimer, whether they're middle school or even younger or older, as you said, it's a higher level of education to remind students of what the intention of the conversation is. So I love that idea and reminder. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is really age dependent. And I can say that from a psychology standpoint. As the brain matures at different rates, different students are able to engage in different levels of abstract thinking and able to separate their emotions out from arguments and views of people differently. So yeah, it definitely, you do have to know your audience a little bit.
Yeah, middle school, never a dull moment for me for sure. So I'm always on my toes with that stuff. I'm like, oh. But yeah, I think that those are some really great tips for teachers who are listening who are thinking about using this in their classroom. I wanted to ask you, what's one philosophical concept or approach every teacher should know and how they can maybe use it in their classroom?
Yeah, so we'll go back to Socrates, and it's basically the notion of Socratic ignorance, right? Which is, you know, knowing that you don't know something. And so, a little interesting that the guy that came up with the Socratic method would realize how little you can know, right? Because he probably did that himself, right? It's probably how he honed the method, right? In order to assail other people's positions, other people's arguments, and to reveal the contradictions and underlying assumptions. He certainly did that to himself on a regular basis, and he probably found out over and over and over again that he had positions that had false underlying assumptions, right? And so, Socrates was very upfront in saying, hey, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything, right? So I think teachers can make use of that, and they don't have to go as hard as Socrates did, right? You're not trying to undermine your students' confidence in your knowledge, but I think what you can demonstrate through occasionally, and honestly, admitting when you don't know something is demonstrating and modeling intellectual humility as well as a growth mindset, right? As somebody who, has a lot of irons in the fire, like I do, I get that question a lot about, well, how do you learn to play the instruments or how do you learn how to do this, that, or the other thing? And really, it's the growth mindset is built around what I was saying earlier, which is that learning is just a series of failures. That's all it is. It's just you fail over and over and over again, and you revise positions, you learn things, you hone skills, and then eventually become good at stuff, right? And so if we want students to become good at stuff, we want them to have a growth mindset. Well, we have to kind of demonstrate that as educators, right? And so we have to, be willing to own up to some failures and to show how we learned from them and how positions changed and that type of thing. And I think that through that, it sort of shifts the classroom again from an environment that is about, answers and standards and testing into one that's about exploration, is about growth. And so that's kind of the tip that I think would really help with some educators in the classroom.
I like hearing that side of we don't really know anything until we really think it through. And like you said, we're kind of all figuring it out. And that brings a different perspective to the teacher student relationship, even in terms of inquiry and exploration. We have these rapid fire questions for teachers that I always ask, and they might not fully apply. I don't know if you teach classes right now, but I don't know if they fully apply. But if they don't, you can just skip it. If that doesn't make sense to what you're doing.
Okay.
Favorite teacher lunch or lunch in general?
So I eat the same lunch every single day.
Okay.
I don't know if I'd say it's my favorite, but I've just built it in order to be optimally healthy. So I eat some cucumbers, some baby carrots, a spinach and turkey sandwich, and a Granny Smith apple. So that's my lunch every single day.
Got all the vegetables in there and some protein and carbs.
Yeah, I try.
There you go. Do you have a worst teacher lunch?
Again, with having the same one every day, nah.
Not so much.
Yeah.
Okay, your best behavior management or maybe philosophical tip for a classroom.
Ooh, that's a tough one. But I think it comes back to, I think it's this idea of validating student ideas and defusing situations, right? So if it's a content-based issue, it goes back to what I was saying before about, listen, you can acknowledge that there's all kinds of different perspectives on an issue. You can have any perspective you want on any issue. That's not really at the heart of what exploration or learning is about. So I think that, again, sort of non-confrontationally, coolly kind of explaining that's probably my top one.
Yeah, that's great. Last lesson you taught.
So I'm not currently teaching in school, so I'm making a little bit more money designing and teaching some classes in a manufacturing environment. So
Yeah.
I'm teaching forklift training and bloodborne pathogens training and those types of things. So I design the courses as well as teach them.
Okay, nice. I think I've heard of that. Is that called an instructional developer or designer or something like that? Is that your job?
Yeah, that's part of it. Yep.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Cool. And then, well, a lot of us take those trainings. They'll probably see you in the videos. We take that
Right.
every year.
Yeah.
Okay. The last question is, best advice from a teacher or mentor when you were first starting out, or just a teacher in general that you've kept kind of close to your heart?
That's a tough one. I think that, I can't think of any particular phrase or quip that sticks with me. But I think that really what altered the entire course of my life was the interest that my mom took in my education, right? Because from a very young age, school didn't end at 3 p.m. I'd come home and my mom would take me and my brother and my sister on field trips, right? We'd go to the local dam or we'd go to a museum or that sort of thing. And, she'd go, look at these dinosaur bones. Could you imagine these things with skin on them and how they'd move and what they would do and just really get you excited about things. And before you know it, as a little kid, you're running around the museum reading all the placards because everything is really interesting, right? And I think that that's just exactly what you want to do for students, right? And my college professor did that for me with philosophy, right? I've heard if you go on the internet and you listen to a philosophy podcast, most of them are very, very dry, dull, boring things, right? And so we wanted to sort of demonstrate to people that that's not the way it has to be, right? You can talk philosophically about Disney princesses or pets or anything else. Really, what it requires is just some enthusiasm and some excitement and some engagement. And so I think that's what it was. More than anything that was ever said, there was a modeling of learning going beyond the classroom, right? Something that is a growth mindset that's lifelong, that you can just look at the world through a different set of eyes, right? Where everything is kind of cool and unique and fascinating. So that's my long-winded answer that doesn't really address it, but
No, yeah, I think that having that lifelong learning, someone has to give that to you. And so you've been lucky to have people give that to you in your life. So that's nice.
yeah.
Yeah. So kind of tying right into that, where can my audience find you if they want to learn more about you and your podcast and what you're doing?
Yeah. So I'm the world's worst marketer. So like I don't have a whole lot of presence online. But if you want to listen to the podcast, it's called From Nowhere to Nothing, and it's anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's out there everywhere.
And I'll link it below for them right underneath this video so they can go ahead and listen. I've listened to a few as well. It is fun. Like you said, it's not dry. It is fun to listen to, and there's a lot of engaging conversation between you and your professor. So yeah, check it out if they're interested. Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I know teachers are going to get a lot of input and a lot of value from what you've brought today, and really appreciate you sharing about all the methods and philosophy and how it incorporates into teaching. So thanks again, Joel.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.